Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Tonight we uncover another story pulled from the darker corners of the past. A story about power, cruelty, and the strange ways people resisted systems designed to break them. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time where you are. Our community stretches across the world, and we love seeing where these stories reach. Now relax, remove distractions, and listen closely, because the story you are about to hear begins on a southern plantation in the year 1859, and it begins with a decision that one father believed would hide his greatest shame. If you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue telling powerful stories that history books often ignore. Stay with us until the end, because what happened after that decision would challenge everything the plantation believed about strength, inheritance, and control. The plantation belonged to a wealthy landowner in coastal South Carolina named Edward Calhoun. Like many planters of his time, Calhoun believed deeply in hierarchy. He believed some people were born to rule and others were born to labor. He believed strength could be measured like livestock, weighed and tested through work in the fields. But the one person who threatened that belief lived inside his own house. His son, Thomas Calhoun. Thomas was 20 years old in the summer of 1859, yet he did not resemble the type of man his father had imagined when he thought about heirs. Thomas was quiet, thin, and often ill. Long hours in the heat left him exhausted. When he tried riding horses, he tired quickly. When he attempted to supervise field work, the overseers often ignored his instructions. To Edward Calhoun, these weaknesses were more than disappointing. They were humiliating. Among wealthy planters, reputation mattered almost as much as land and money. Sons were expected to prove their strength, to carry forward the family name and expand its influence. But Thomas showed little interest in plantation life. He spent most of his days reading in the study or wandering the edges of the property where the marshlands met the forest. The overseers whispered that he was soft. Some even joked that the young master had more interest in books than in power. Edward Calhoun heard those whispers, and they angered him. One evening, he summoned the plantation doctor to examine his son privately. The doctor spent nearly an hour inside the study while Thomas answered questions about his health. When the doctor finally emerged, Edward Calhoun stood waiting. "Well?" the planter asked. The doctor hesitated before answering. "Your son is not sick," he said carefully, "but he is delicate." Edward's face darkened. "What does that mean?" "It means he may not possess the physical strength that you expected." The doctor paused again. "And there may also be concerns about his ability to produce children." The room fell silent. For Edward Calhoun, the idea that his only son might fail to produce heirs was unthinkable. He dismissed the doctor without another word. But the thought remained inside his mind. If Thomas could not prove his strength, then the Calhoun name would weaken in the eyes of other planters. And Edward Calhoun refused to accept that. A week later, he made a decision that would change several lives forever. On the far end of the plantation worked a woman known among the enslaved community for her strength. Her name was Amma, though many of the overseers called her simply the Giant. Amma stood nearly 6 feet tall and carried bundles of cotton that most men struggled to lift. She had survived years of brutal labor in the fields without ever collapsing from exhaustion. Even the overseers respected her physical power. One morning, Edward Calhoun ordered Amma brought to the main house. She stood silently in the yard while the planter explained his plan. Thomas would spend time working beside her in the fields. He would learn discipline, endurance, and strength through labor. Edward believed that proximity to someone like Amma might force his son to change. But there was another reason he did not speak aloud. If Thomas proved capable of fathering a child with Amma, the doctor's doubts about his ability to produce heirs would disappear. To Edward Calhoun, it seemed like a practical solution. To Amma, it felt like something else entirely. When Thomas arrived in the fields the following morning, the other workers watched with quiet curiosity. The young master had never worked among them before. Amma showed him how to lift the heavy sacks of cotton and carry them across the rows. At first, Thomas struggled badly. His hands blistered quickly. The heat drained his energy within hours. But something unexpected began happening during those long days in the field. Amma spoke to him, not with anger, not with fear, but with calm honesty. She told him about surviving years of forced labor, about watching families torn apart through sales and punishment, about learning how to endure pain without allowing it to destroy the mind. Thomas listened more than he spoke. For the first time in his life, he was hearing the truth about the system his father controlled. Weeks passed. Slowly, Thomas began gaining strength. His hands grew calloused from work. His posture changed as his body adapted to the labor. But something deeper was changing too. His understanding. Amma noticed it first. One evening, after the workers finished their tasks, Thomas sat beside the edge of the field, staring toward the plantation house. "My father thinks strength comes from power," he said quietly. Amma shook her head. "Real strength comes from surviving things meant to break you." Thomas looked at her thoughtfully. "I think you may be the strongest person on this plantation." Amma smiled slightly. "Strength is not something people like your father measure correctly." Months passed before Edward Calhoun asked the question that he had been waiting to ask. He summoned Thomas to the study. "Well," he demanded, "have you proven yourself yet?" Thomas remained silent for several seconds. Then he answered calmly, "Yes." Edward leaned forward eagerly. "You see," he said, "I told you the boy simply needed the right circumstances." But Thomas shook his head. "That is not what I meant." Edward frowned. "What are you talking about?" Thomas looked directly into his father's eyes. "I have proven something about you." The room grew quiet. "What nonsense is this?" Thomas spoke slowly. "You believe strength is something you control." Edward's expression hardened. "I do control it." "No," Thomas replied. "You only control fear." The planter slammed his hand on the desk. "Have you forgotten who you are speaking to?" Thomas stood calmly. "No." Then he added something Edward Calhoun had never expected to hear. "But I know who Amma is speaking to." Edward froze, because at that moment he realized something he had not considered. His son had spent months listening to a woman he believed was only property. And in those months, Thomas had begun seeing the world through her eyes. The plantation system that Edward Calhoun built his life upon had suddenly become something else in his son's mind. A prison. For everyone involved. And from that moment forward, the man Edward believed unfit for reproduction would become something far more dangerous. A man capable of questioning the entire system his father believed could never be challenged. Edward Calhoun stared at his son for several seconds without speaking. The room felt smaller than before, the heavy wooden desk between them suddenly useless as a barrier. Thomas stood calmly, his hands no longer soft like they had been months earlier. The work in the fields had changed him in ways Edward had not expected. "You've been spending too much time listening," Edward said finally. Thomas did not argue. "Yes," he replied. Edward rose slowly from his chair. "That woman was meant to teach you discipline, not fill your head with ideas." Thomas looked toward the tall window where the plantation fields stretched into the distance. "She did teach me discipline," he said quietly. Edward's patience began slipping. "And what exactly did you learn?" Thomas turned back toward him. "That the strongest people here are the ones who survive what you built." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Edward Calhoun had spent his entire life believing the plantation system proved his superiority. The land, the workers, the wealth, all of it confirmed his power in the eyes of neighboring planters. Now his own son was questioning that power. "You forget something," Edward said coldly. "What?" "I can send that woman away tomorrow." Thomas did not react immediately. "You could." "And I will if this nonsense continues." For the first time, Thomas's voice hardened. "That would not change what I have seen." Edward stepped closer. "You think working in the fields for a few weeks makes you understand anything?" Thomas held his ground. It makes me understand enough. The planter studied him carefully. Something about his son's posture had shifted. The boy who once avoided conflict now stood with quiet certainty. Edward realized something uncomfortable. Amma had not simply made Thomas stronger. She had made him aware. And awareness was dangerous. Later that evening, Edward summoned the overseer. "I want the woman moved to another section of the plantation," he ordered. The overseer nodded. "Yes, sir." "And the boy?" Edward hesitated before answering. "Thomas returns to the house tomorrow." But the overseer had already noticed something. "Sir," he said cautiously, "the workers respect that woman." Edward waved his hand dismissively. "They respect fear." The overseer did not argue. Yet the next morning, when Amma was moved to a distant part of the plantation, the atmosphere in the fields changed immediately. The workers noticed her absence. Conversation slowed. The rhythm of labor felt heavier. Thomas noticed it as well. He spent the day walking restlessly through the plantation yard. For the first time since working in the fields, he felt the distance between the house and the quarters clearly. That evening, he walked down the long dirt path leading toward the fields where Amma had once worked. But she was gone. An older woman standing nearby noticed him searching. "She's in the southern fields now," the woman said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Thank you." The woman studied him carefully. "You shouldn't come down here anymore," she added. "Why not?" "Your father won't like it." Thomas looked across the darkening fields. "My father has never liked it." Days passed. Thomas returned to his old life inside the plantation house, but the silence of those rooms now felt unbearable. The books he once enjoyed reading seemed distant from the reality he had witnessed. He had seen families working until their hands bled. He had heard stories whispered quietly at night about people sold away from their children. The system that had once seemed normal now felt impossible to ignore. One evening, he walked into his father's study again. Edward looked up immediately. "I thought we settled this matter." Thomas shook his head. "We didn't." Edward sighed heavily. "What do you want now?" Thomas spoke carefully. "I want you to stop treating people like tools." Edward laughed sharply. "You have been reading too many northern pamphlets." "I have been watching." Edward stood again, frustration rising in his voice. "Watching what?" "People surviving something they should never have to survive." Edward leaned across the desk. "You forget something important, Thomas." "What?" "This plantation feeds hundreds of people. Without it, they would have nothing." Thomas answered quietly. "They would have freedom." Edward's expression hardened into something cold. "You sound like a fool." Thomas did not respond. Instead, he said something that Edward had never imagined hearing from his son. "One day this system will end." The planter's jaw tightened. "You think a few ideas can destroy an entire way of life?" Thomas looked toward the window again. "Not ideas." "What then?" "People." Edward dismissed him with an angry gesture. But after Thomas left the room, the planter remained standing beside the desk for a long time. For the first time since his son was born, Edward Calhoun realized something unsettling. The boy he once believed too weak to carry his legacy had become something far more unpredictable. And somewhere in the southern fields of that plantation, the woman Edward believed was the only property had started that transformation simply by telling the truth. The following months would quietly reshape everything Edward Calhoun believed about strength. Because the man he once called unfit was beginning to discover a kind of power his father had never understood. The power to see the world clearly. And once a man sees clearly, he can never return to the blindness that once protected the system around him. The change in Thomas Calhoun did not happen loudly. There was no dramatic argument that ended the system overnight. Instead, it began quietly, almost invisibly, in small choices that most people on the plantation did not notice at first. But Amma noticed. Weeks after she had been moved to the southern fields, she saw Thomas walking across the rows one afternoon. He was not dressed like the overseers. He carried no whip, his clothes were simple, and the sun had darkened his skin from the months he had spent working outside. Amma stopped lifting the cotton sack when she saw him approach. "You should not be here," she said calmly. Thomas nodded. "My father says the same thing." Amma looked around at the workers nearby. "They will watch you." "That is fine," Thomas replied. She studied him carefully. "You have changed." Thomas gave a quiet smile. "You told me something once." "What?" "That real strength is surviving what was meant to break you." Amma placed the cotton sack down. "Yes." Thomas looked across the field where workers bent over rows of plants under the heavy sun. "I am starting to understand that." Amma lowered her voice. "Understanding is dangerous on a place like this." Thomas knew she was right, but he also knew something else. The more he understood, the less he could pretend that nothing was wrong. Over the next months, Thomas began doing small things that seemed insignificant to outsiders. When workers were punished unfairly, he quietly spoke to the overseer and had the punishment reduced. When families were about to be separated through sale, he convinced his father that selling them would hurt the plantation's productivity. Edward Calhoun noticed these changes. At first, he dismissed them as temporary weakness. But the pattern continued. One evening, Edward called his son into the study again. "You spend too much time worrying about the people in the fields," he said. Thomas remained calm. "They are the ones doing the work. That work belongs to me." Thomas shook his head slightly. "No, it belongs to them." Edward slammed his hand against the desk. "You speak like a man who has forgotten his place." Thomas answered quietly, "I am learning it." Edward leaned forward. "You are my son. This land will be yours one day." Thomas looked around the room. The walls were covered with ledgers, maps of cotton fields, and portraits of men who had built their wealth on the same system. "I am not sure I want it." Edward's voice turned cold. "You will take it." Thomas met his father's gaze. "And what if the world changes before then?" Edward laughed sharply. "The world does not change." But Thomas remembered something Amma had told him weeks earlier while they rested at the edge of the field. "Every system built on suffering eventually cracks," she had said. "Why?" Thomas asked her. "Because suffering does not stay silent forever." That sentence stayed in his mind long after he returned to the house. Months passed. By the summer of 1860, whispers about Thomas had spread across the plantation almost as widely as the whispers about Amma's strength. Some of the workers began calling him something quietly among themselves. The listening master, because unlike his father, Thomas listened. One afternoon, a young boy working in the fields collapsed from heat exhaustion. The overseer raised his whip, angry that the boy had stopped working. Before the whip came down, Thomas stepped between them. "That will not happen again," he said calmly. The overseer hesitated. "Your father won't approve?" Thomas held his ground. "My father is not here." The whip never touched the boy. Later that evening, word of what happened spread through the quarters. Amma heard the story from one of the women. She sat quietly outside her cabin, staring toward the distant plantation house where the lights glowed against the dark sky. An older man sat beside her. "The boy you trained is becoming something," he said. Amma shook her head. "I did not train him." "What did you do then?" "I told him the truth." The man nodded slowly. "Sometimes that is more powerful than training." Meanwhile, inside the plantation house, Edward Calhoun studied the latest cotton records with growing frustration. Production had slowed slightly over the past months, partly because Thomas had begun interfering with the overseer's punishments. "You are weakening discipline," Edward told him one night. Thomas answered calmly. "Fear is not discipline." Edward stared at him. "It has worked for generations." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "For generations, people have also been waiting for it to end." Edward laughed again, but this time the sound carried less confidence. "You believe you can change something this large?" Thomas shook his head. No. Then why fight it? Because it is already changing. Edward dismissed him angrily. But that night, long after Thomas left the room, Edward walked to the window overlooking the dark plantation fields. Something had shifted, not just in his son, in the world itself. News from the northern states had begun sounding more troubling. Newspapers spoke of arguments growing sharper between politicians. Some people were even beginning to whisper about war. Edward did not believe such things would reach his plantation, but Thomas did. And far out in the southern fields, Amma watched the same horizon with quiet understanding, because both of them sensed the same truth. The system Edward Calhoun believed it would last forever was already beginning to crack. And when it finally broke, the strongest people on that plantation would not be the ones who had ruled it. They would be the ones who had survived it. The summer of 1860 passed slowly, but something in the air across the South had begun to change. Even on the Calhoun plantation, far from the political debates of distant cities, people could feel the tension building like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Travelers coming through nearby towns carried troubling news. Newspapers spoke about arguments growing louder between northern and southern states. Politicians were threatening to divide the country itself. Edward Calhoun dismissed the talk whenever it reached his ears. Politicians argue every year, he said. But Thomas listened carefully, and Amma watched, because both of them had begun to understand something Edward refused to see. The world outside the plantation was shifting. One afternoon, Thomas rode into town for supplies. While waiting near the general store, he overheard a group of men speaking beside a wagon. "South Carolina may leave the Union," one man said. Another shook his head. "If that happens, the whole country could split apart." Thomas remained silent, but the words stayed with him long after he returned to the plantation. That evening, he walked down to the southern fields again where Amma worked. The sun was low, turning the cotton rows gold beneath the fading light. Amma noticed him before he spoke. "You heard something," she said. Thomas nodded. "There may be war." Amma did not look surprised. She placed the cotton sack down slowly. "War has been building for years," she said. Thomas sat on a wooden fence post beside the field. "If war comes, everything could change." Amma studied him carefully. "Change does not always come gently." "I know." For a moment, they both watched the workers finishing the last rows before sunset. Then Thomas said something quietly. "If the war ends slavery, what will people do?" Amma looked across the land that had held her captive for most of her life. "They will do the same thing they have always done." "What is that?" "They will survive." Thomas lowered his eyes. "My father believes survival only belongs to the powerful." Amma shook her head. "Your father has never understood survival." "Then what is it?" Amma looked directly at him. "Survival is waking up every day in a system built to destroy you and refusing to let it." Thomas sat silently for a long time after that, because he realized something uncomfortable. Everything he had been taught about strength was wrong. Meanwhile, inside the plantation house, Edward Calhoun had begun noticing the way people looked at his son. The overseers spoke about Thomas with confusion. Some even seemed to respect him in ways they never respected the planter himself. That disturbed Edward deeply. One evening, he confronted Thomas again. "You spend too much time among the workers," he said. Thomas did not deny it. "They are part of this place." "They are labor," Edward corrected. Thomas shook his head. "They are people." Edward's voice hardened. "You forget who built this plantation." "No," Thomas replied. "I am starting to understand who really built it." Edward stared at him with anger and something else. Fear. Because the ideas inside his son's mind were spreading quietly through the plantation. Workers had begun noticing that Thomas listened to them. That alone was dangerous. One night, an elderly man in the quarters spoke quietly to Amma as they sat beside a small fire. "The young master is changing things," the man said. Amma nodded slowly. "He is changing himself." "Do you think it will matter?" Amma looked toward the distant house lights glowing above the fields. Every change begins with someone refusing to see the world the way it was before. The old man poked the fire with a stick. And the father? Amma exhaled slowly. Men like Edward Calhoun believe the world belongs to them. And if it doesn't, then they will fight to keep it. Those words proved true sooner than anyone expected. In December of 1860, South Carolina officially announced that it would leave the United States. The nation had begun breaking apart. When the news reached the plantation, Edward Calhoun gathered several neighboring planters in his study. They spoke late into the night about protecting their land and their way of life. Thomas listened from the hallway outside. The words he heard confirmed what he already feared. War was coming. Real war. Not the distant arguments people had talked about for years. And war meant something else too. If the Union Army marched south, slavery itself could become the center of the conflict. That night, Thomas walked once more to the southern fields, where Amma stood beneath the moonlight finishing the last of the work. "It has started," he said. Amma nodded. "I know." Thomas looked across the quiet plantation that had shaped both of their lives in very different ways. "If war reaches here, nothing will ever be the same." Amma placed the final cotton sack onto the wagon. "Nothing stays the same forever." Thomas looked toward the big house where his father still believed his world would last forever. "And when it ends?" he asked. Amma met his eyes calmly. "Then we will see who was truly strong." Because the man Edward Calhoun once called unfit for reproduction was about to witness something his father never imagined. A world where power built on chains could collapse. And when that day arrived, the lessons Thomas had learned from the strongest woman on the plantation would matter far more than the legacy his father had tried to force upon him. The winter of 1861 settled heavily over the Calhoun plantation. The fields were quiet, but the silence no longer felt peaceful. News from the outside world arrived more often now, carried by riders passing through nearby towns and by newspapers that Edward Calhoun read late into the night. The arguments between the North and the South had grown into something larger, something violent. In April of that year, the first real battles began. When the news reached the plantation, Edward gathered several of the white men from neighboring farms in his study. Their voices carried loudly through the halls as they discussed loyalty to the South and the need to defend their way of life. Thomas listened again from the doorway. His father spoke with confidence. "This war will be over quickly," Edward said. "The North cannot control the South's land." The men around the table nodded. But Thomas noticed something in their faces that the older generation refused to admit. Uncertainty. Later that evening, Thomas walked down to the quarters again. Amma sat outside her cabin, sharpening a small farm blade used for cutting stalks in the fields. "You heard the news," she said without looking up. "Yes." Amma placed the blade beside her. "War has begun." Thomas sat beside her on the wooden step. "My father believes the South will win." Amma shrugged. "Men with power always believe that." Thomas stared out across the dark plantation. "And what do you believe?" Amma thought for a moment before answering. "I believe war breaks things." "Things?" "Systems." Thomas nodded slowly, because that was exactly what he had begun to hope for. The months that followed brought more troubling reports from the outside world. Battles were fought in places with unfamiliar names. Soldiers marched across states that had once seemed far away from the quiet plantation roads. And gradually the war moved closer. Plantations across the South began losing young men who left to join the Confederate Army. Some of Edward Calhoun's neighbors rode away proudly in uniform, promising to return before the year ended. Not all of them would. Life on the plantation changed quickly after that. With many overseers and local men gone, the work in the fields grew heavier. Amma and the others labored longer hours to keep the cotton harvest moving. Thomas helped whenever he could, but Edward grew increasingly frustrated with his son. "You should be helping defend our state," Edward told him one evening. Thomas answered calmly, "I will not fight to protect slavery." Edward's face turned red with anger. You shame your own family. Thomas met his gaze. No, I refuse to protect something that should never have existed. Edward slammed the study door so hard the sound echoed through the house. But outside the plantation walls, the war continued reshaping the world, whether Edward accepted it or not. By 1863, the conflict had grown larger than anyone first imagined. News arrived that the Union government had issued something called the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people free in Confederate states. The news did not immediately change life on the plantation. Edward Calhoun dismissed it. The Union cannot enforce anything here, he said. But the workers in the quarters heard the rumors. Freedom was now part of the war, and that knowledge spread quietly through the plantation like a hidden fire. Amma heard the news one evening from a traveling man who passed through the nearby road. She found Thomas later that night standing near the barn. They say freedom has been declared, she told him. Thomas looked at her with cautious hope. It may take time for that freedom to reach here. Amma nodded. But it is coming. They both knew that war moved slowly through the countryside. Yet every month brought the conflict closer. Union armies pushed deeper into the South. Railroads were destroyed. Cities burned. And plantations like Edward Calhoun's began living with a quiet fear they had never known before. One afternoon, a rider arrived carrying urgent news from a nearby town. Union troops had been spotted moving through the region. Edward Calhoun ordered the plantation gates closed immediately. But gates could not stop the war. That night, Thomas walked to the southern fields again, where Amma stood watching the horizon. You feel it too, he said. Amma nodded. Yes. What do you feel? The end. Thomas looked toward the distant road where dust sometimes rose from passing wagons. My father still believes the system will survive this war. Amma shook her head slowly. Men like your father built their lives on something they believed would last forever. And it won't? Amma turned toward him. Nothing built on suffering lasts forever. Thomas remained silent. Because deep down he knew she was right. The world Edward Calhoun believed in was already beginning to collapse. And when the Union soldiers finally reached their plantation, the strongest people on that land would not be the ones who owned it. They would be the ones who had endured it. The year 1864 brought the war closer than anyone on the Calhoun plantation had imagined. For years, the conflict had felt distant, something happening across rivers and cities far away. But now the sound of war was slowly moving south through the countryside. Travelers passing along the road spoke of entire towns changing overnight. Union armies were marching deeper into southern states, destroying railroads, seizing food supplies, and burning plantations that supported the Confederate cause. Edward Calhoun refused to believe it would reach his land. This plantation has stood for generations, he said one evening while speaking with several neighbors. No army is going to walk through these fields. But Thomas had already heard enough reports to know the truth. War did not respect property lines. War did not respect pride. War moved wherever it needed to go. One afternoon, a wagon arrived carrying wounded soldiers from a nearby skirmish. The men were tired, dirty, and frightened. They spoke quietly about Union troops moving across the region faster than expected. The overseer carried the news straight to Edward. They may reach the county within weeks, he said. Edward's face tightened. Then we will protect what belongs to us. But the plantation no longer felt secure. Even the workers in the fields sensed the shift. Conversations in the quarters grew quieter and more hopeful at the same time. For years, people had whispered about freedom like it was a distant dream. Now it sounded like something approaching down the road. Amma watched the horizon often during those days. Thomas found her one evening standing at the edge of the cotton fields where the land sloped gently toward the forest. You're waiting, he said. Amma nodded. For something that has been coming for a long time. Thomas looked toward the road. Union soldiers were spotted 2 towns away this morning. Amma did not look surprised. Then the end is closer. Thomas exhaled slowly. My father will try to fight them. Amma finally turned toward him. Your father cannot fight history. Thomas said nothing, because deep down he understood that truth better than anyone else on the plantation. For years, Edward Calhoun had believed power came from ownership, land, people, wealth, authority. But war was exposing something he had never imagined. Systems could collapse. Entire worlds could disappear. A few days later, the sound of distant gunfire echoed faintly through the countryside. It was the first time anyone on the plantation had heard the war with their own ears. The workers stopped what they were doing and listened. Even the overseer stood still for a moment. Thomas looked across the fields and saw something he had never seen before. Hope. Not loud hope. Not celebration. But a quiet understanding moving through the people who had spent their lives surviving the plantation system. Amma saw it too. That night, the quarters were filled with quiet conversations around small fires. An older man leaned toward Amma. "You think it's really happening?" he asked. Amma nodded slowly. "Yes." "What will freedom look like?" Amma stared into the fire. "Different for everyone." The man poked the flames gently with a stick. "I just want to wake up one morning without someone owning my life." Amma looked up at the stars. That morning is coming. Meanwhile, inside the plantation house, Edward Calhoun sat alone in his study with a glass of whiskey. The war reports arriving from nearby towns were worse than he wanted to admit. Union armies were moving faster than expected. Plantations across the region had already been abandoned. Some planters fled south with their families. Others stayed and waited. Edward Calhoun chose to wait. "This land is mine," he said quietly to himself. But ownership meant little against an army. Late that night, Thomas entered the study. "You should prepare," he said calmly. "For what?" "For when the soldiers arrive?" Edward laughed bitterly. "You think I will hand over everything I built?" Thomas looked around the room filled with ledgers and maps. "You didn't build it alone." Edward slammed his glass down. "I built it with authority." Thomas shook his head. "No. You built it with control." Edward stared at his son. "And what do you think happens when that control disappears?" Thomas answered quietly. "People finally breathe." Edward turned away, furious. But outside the plantation house, the future was already moving closer. Within days, the first column of Union soldiers would march along the road leading toward the Calhoun land. And when they arrived, the system Edward Calhoun believed would last forever would finally meet the one force it could never control: change. Because the man once considered too weak to carry his father's legacy had already understood something the planter never did. Real strength was not about owning power. It was about surviving long enough to see power fall. The morning the soldiers finally came was strangely quiet. No thunder, no shouting, no warning. Just the slow sound of boots moving along the dusty road that cut through the countryside toward the Calhoun plantation. The sun had only just begun rising when one of the field hands spotted them first. A thin line of blue uniforms appeared beyond the tree line, marching steadily toward the property. Word spread through the plantation faster than any bell could ring. "The soldiers are coming." Workers paused in the fields. Women stepped out from the cabins. Children ran toward the road before being pulled back by nervous parents. For years, the war had been something distant. Now it was walking straight toward them. Amma stood near the edge of the cotton rows, watching the line of soldiers grow clearer in the morning light. Thomas approached quietly beside her. "It's happening," he said. Amma nodded. "Yes." Her voice carried no fear, only certainty. Because the moment she had imagined for years had finally arrived. Inside the big house, Edward Calhoun had already been told. The overseer burst into the study where Edward sat reviewing plantation accounts. "They're here," the overseer said. Edward stood slowly. "How many?" "Dozens at least, maybe more coming behind them." Edward moved to the window and saw the dust rising from the road. For the first time in his life, the plantation owner felt something unfamiliar. Powerlessness. He had built his entire identity around control, land under his authority, people under his command. Now an army stood outside that control, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Outside, the soldiers entered the property calmly. Their commander rode at the front, studying the fields and buildings with careful attention. When the first group reached the yard near the plantation house, Thomas stepped forward to meet them. The officer dismounted from his horse. "This plantation belongs to Edward Calhoun?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Yes." "And you are?" "His son." The officer studied him briefly. "You should know that under Union command, enslaved people here are no longer considered property." Thomas looked across the yard where dozens of workers stood watching silently. "I understand," he said. The officer nodded once. Then he turned toward the fields. "Spread the word." A group of soldiers began walking across the plantation, speaking to the workers in calm voices. "You are free." At first, no one moved. The words sounded unreal. Freedom had been whispered about for generations, but hearing it spoken openly felt almost impossible. Amma stood still for several seconds before she began walking slowly toward the soldiers. One of them spoke again. "You are free now." Amma looked at him carefully. Free. The word carried weight she had never been allowed to feel before. Around her, others began stepping forward as well. Some cried quietly. Some simply stood frozen, unsure what freedom meant after a lifetime of captivity. Thomas watched it all unfold. The system his father had built was collapsing in front of his eyes, not with violence, but with a sentence. "You are free." Behind him, the door of the plantation house opened. Edward Calhoun stepped outside. The old planter looked across the yard at the soldiers speaking with the workers. His face tightened as he realized exactly what was happening. "This is my property," he said sharply. The Union officer turned toward him. "Not anymore." Edward's voice rose. "You cannot simply take everything." The officer's reply was calm. "The war has already taken it." Edward looked across the fields he had spent his life controlling. For decades, the plantation had obeyed his commands. Now the people within it were walking away. Amma stepped toward the road leading beyond the plantation gates. For a moment, she stopped and looked back across the land. Years of forced labor, years of survival, years of strength. Beside her, Thomas stood quietly. "You were right," he said. Amma turned slightly. "About what?" "That the strongest people here were the ones who survived." Amma looked at the road stretching into the distance. "Yes." "And now?" Amma began walking again. "Now they finally live." Behind them, the plantation that once represented absolute control was slowly emptying. Families gathered their belongings. Workers walked away from the fields they had been forced to harvest for generations. The world Edward Calhoun believed would last forever had ended in a single morning. Thomas remained standing in the yard for a long time watching the people leave. The man his father once called Unfit had discovered something far more powerful than the legacy Edward tried to force upon him. Understanding. And the strongest woman on the plantation had shown him how to find it. Because real strength had never belonged to the man who owned the land. It belonged to the people who endured it long enough to walk away.